So I wanted to introduce our special guest. His name is Levi Parkin. Levi, I don't know if you want to wave. You can find him there in the Hollywood squares. And Levi is the City of Lawrence's forestry supervisor. Is that correct? Got your title correct? And I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And oops, you unmuted yourself, and then I muted you back.
We're good.
Why don't you go ahead and start and just kind of tell us about yourself and your job and what the sorts of things that you do for the City of Lawrence.
Okay. So my name is Levi Parkin. I always try to start introducing myself as first and foremost, I'm a husband and a father. But I'm a board certified master arborist. I have a degree in ornamental horticulture from Kansas State. And I currently fill the role as forestry supervisor for the City of Lawrence. Prior to this, I did residential tree care for 13 years. So I was a climbing production arborist. For the last 5 years of that, for a company down in Springfield. I'm an avid competitive tree climber and kind of just an all around, I'd say tree nerd, but the older I get, the more that kind of expands into all sorts of things. I find myself just being a nerd in general, and in the best sort of way. For the City of Lawrence, what I primarily do is, myself and my staff, our main objective is, the safety and health of our urban forest. So really the easiest way to explain what we do is we're kind of the Lorax, right? We speak for the tree, and is our job to act as kind of the mediators between what humans need to go about their days and stay healthy and safe while living amongst trees and still getting all of the benefits we get from those. So I try to explain it to people that we're trying to, I guess, find the middle ground between what people need for trees to be and the niche we need them to fill. Whenever, really what trees kind of want to do is just live in the woods and be left alone. Which, there's a lot to be said for that, I suppose. But
yeah, away from those pesky people.
Yeah.
So how did you get interested in forestry? I mean, how did that happen?
Well, I grew up actually down outside of Pomona, just south of Pomona. My folks had about 3 acres. My dad was an avid gardener. My mom was as well. And even, my dad grew a vegetable garden. My mom loved flowers and that kind of stuff. And I spent as much time as I possibly could as a kid kind of traipsing through the woods. I loved mushroom hunting and squirrel hunting and fishing and, kind of those typical things, I guess, we expect young men from the country to be into. But, I just always felt such a connection to the forest, to the woods, and to nature. And I found myself in college I decided I was going to be an art major because I really liked art. And I was fortunate to have a great advisor who told me, there's a reason they call them starving artists.
Yeah.
So if you're going to be an artist, you need to find something tangible to do with it. And I just said, why not combine my 2 interests, which are, plants and art, and go to school for landscape design. And so I transferred to Kansas State, and was fortunate to find myself a couple of just excellent advisors. And one of them was a woman named Kathy Lavis, who just retired from K-State this past year. And, just being surrounded by people that are truly passionate about the industry and passionate about the plants we care for and grow and all this stuff. And I was talking to her one day, and my whole goal was to start a landscaping company, but I wanted to know how to do all of the things. You know, I wanted to do landscape installs and hardscapes, and I wanted to be able to do tree pruning and tree removal. And she said, if you're really serious about that, you should really go work for this local arborist, and just try it for a summer. And I went and worked for a guy named Charlie Podorf, who owns Wildcat Tree Service there in Manhattan. And as they say, I got the sawdust in my blood, and I couldn't find myself leaving. You know, I've changed what I do in my work a lot as far as scope. You know, I've done everything from production tree care to plant health care to sales. I managed a company in Kansas City for a couple of years, and then I wound up, I really wanted to take a step back and not be stressed all the time. So I went back in production tree care, and wound up being a safety coordinator for the company I worked for, and working as a crew leader. And just, you know, I love the work. I love the camaraderie with people. But it happened to be that my wife and I had our son. So he's 2.5 now. And we had him without health insurance.
Oh, yeah.
And it kind of got me thinking, you know, might be time to be a real adult and go find a job with insurance and benefits and that kind of stuff. And so I started looking into municipal positions, and here I am. So that's kind of the
Story. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I think the sentence that you said about being a professional or competitive tree climber is something that we're all really intrigued by. And Jill is asking, have you ever climbed to the top of a sequoia? So maybe you can tell us about how in the world, what is competitive tree climbing, and how'd you get involved, and how high have you gone?
Okay. I have not climbed to the top of a sequoia, and I actually, as much of a shame as it is, I haven't made it, you know, to the redwood forest yet. But that is going to happen in my lifetime. I have a lot of friends that have gone out, and there's actually a group that does volunteer work, and you pay, I think it's like $200, and you pay for a membership to this group, and they do a big event for a week every year, and they basically go out and they prune the sequoias in campgrounds for a not-for-profit group. And so it's kind of a cool way to give back and to get to go climb cool trees. As far as competitive tree climbing, so I owe so much of my career and my progression and my interest and passion to competitive tree climbing. And most people don't know such a thing exists, which is understandable. It's kind of a niche thing, but it's actually gaining popularity. So whenever I started climbing in 2008, really the only game in town, so to speak, was the International Society of Arboriculture hosts chapter events. And then they also do the International Tree Climbing Championship, which is people from all over the world. But the Midwest chapter of the ISA, which is at the time was Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska. Since then, Iowa's left, and Missouri, sorry. So I would go, you know, the first couple of years I competed, it was in Kansas City, Missouri. So the first 2 years it was at Swope Park, and then they had it for 2 years in Olathe. So it was a fun thing to do. In the meantime, I got injured and crushed my leg under a cottonwood tree. So I took a little bit of a hiatus from tree climbing, from competitions anyway. But then whenever I moved to Springfield, the company I work for, that's like a huge part of our culture. And so we would go, they have a huge international competition that's kind of non-sanctioned or whatever. It's not part of the ISA, called the Charlotte, which is in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so we competed there. And then I have a buddy from Maryland who started another event called North American Open Masters. And so the first 2 years I volunteered for that. This year was the first year that I actually competed in that, but it's like a invitation only, has certain criteria that you have to meet to compete. So I'd worked as a judge for that for 2 years and then competed this year. And then I also work a lot with the folks, a couple friends of mine from Arkansas. So one of my good friends and mentors is a guy named David Rains, and he works out of Bentonville. And he and this other guy, Chad Bryant, started an event called the Natural State Tree Climbing Championship. And so the first year was in Fayetteville, and I was a judge for that. And then it's kind of bounced all over the state. And so I've competed in that and judged in that. This past year, I was actually the head judge for the event. So I was the guy who was answering all the questions and making all the hard calls.
So do you climb trees just like freehand or with ropes or with spikes, or
so it's all on rope. And so the general format is that there are 4 or 5 preliminary events. So there's what they call a work climb, which is basically 4 stations in the tree that replicates like moving through the tree and pruning. So there's handsaw stations, there's a pole saw station, there's one where there's a bucket full of limbs that you toss a limb at a target to show that you can, throw debris out of the tree and miss somebody's air conditioner or whatever. And then there's what they call a plumb bob, which it's a limb with a weight hanging on it. You have to show that you can get out to the end of that limb without the plumb bob touching the ground. And then there's usually an ascent event, which is basically just guys racing up a rope. Sometimes they do like a head-to-head event. So with the North American Open Masters, they do it at night with strobe lights and black lights, and they have a live DJ that comes out and plays music, and they have video screens, and it's a huge thing.
Rock and roll tree climbing. That sounds
yeah
fun.
yeah, it's pretty out there.
That's
But ISA, they just do it during the day, and it's, one guy going by himself or one lady going by himself, just going up the rope as fast as you can.
Well, sounds like Jackie Bogner commented that she attended opening day of the Eureka, California Skywalk, where you end up 80 to 100 feet of 180-foot redwoods. Spectacular.
Oh, wow.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's impressive.
I'll post the link, but it's accessible to everyone, anyone, everyone. And it was mid-June, and I never saw a frown on anybody's face. They were in awe. Everyone was in awe of what they were experiencing, just surrounded by redwoods, and you're in the middle of it.
That sounds pretty amazing.
It was.
You're in the midst of it.
Yes, you're in the midst of it, a forest.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's an incredible, without sounding too hokey, I mean, it's a sometimes pretty spiritual experience. I mean, every now and then, especially, for somebody who does it for a living, it's pretty easy to start taking it for granted. But every now and then you find yourself in a tree and you catch a glimpse of something, or you find yourself just looking around and looking at what you're doing. I just actually, maybe 2 weeks ago, I pruned a big English oak in Oak Hill Cemetery over by the mausoleum. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, I made a cut in the top of this tree, and I looked down at the growth rings, and I realized that this limb that's sticking out of the top of this tree is, 80 years old. And it looks, the growth rings look like a phone book. I mean, they're just as tight as can be. And to sit there and look at that tree and think, this tree has stood here for 200 years, probably. Yeah. I mean, this tree saw Kansas become a state. the history that they have, just their presence on this earth for the length of time that they're here. It's almost unfathomable. I mean, you think about the redwoods and, trees that have been standing for 1,000 years and all that they've seen and done, and they've just stood here stoically and observed it all in their peaceful silence. And trees are just crazy cool things. So
No, they are. And that actually is a perfect segue to a conversation about our movie. Because I mean, that was certainly my takeaway, is just, you take so much of that for granted, and then you realize that all this activity is going on under your feet, underground.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you'd like to comment on the whole intercommunication between trees and a forest, and what that entails.
Yeah, and so I actually haven't watched the movie yet. I think I'd mentioned that I thought about watching it in advance just so I could kind of have that that edge, I guess. But yeah, so there, especially in the forest, there's this whole mycelial community. It's this interrelationship between fungus and the roots of trees, that it's all basically this big mat that's interwoven, interconnected, and it's how trees communicate amongst themselves. And so I was watching this video the other day, and they were talking about just a basic research study that they did, where they were looking at trees being able to trigger a pest response. And they're looking at this response that I think it was tomato plants maybe had to aphids. And they were showing the difference between tomato plants or just flowers. Anyway, so they had them that they were potted individually. They had some that were in a pot altogether. And then they had some that were in a pot altogether that they had inoculated with mycelium.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would put aphids on one plant and see what the other plants did. And what they realized is, once they inoculated those with that mycelium, those other plants would start to produce a chemical that was a deterrent to those aphids. And so it was using this mycelial community to help boost the health of its neighbors, so they might lose this one to this pest or whatever, but the others down the line are for the better for it. And there are a lot of ways actually that trees interact as a community. I mean, you think about, and I was thinking about this earlier today, that we don't, I think, sometimes think about how much trees actually need each other. So there are trees that don't do particularly well in the sunlight. And so one really good example is sugar maples. Sugar maples kind of want to be an understory tree. And so you go somewhere like Old West Lawrence, where we have a bunch of really big old sugar maples and big old pin oaks. And we've lost a lot of our pin oaks due to a disease called hypoxylin canker over the last 5 years or so. And so we'll lose this big pin oak that was shading this sugar maple. And so then we see this big old sugar maple that was really interdependent on that big pin oak being being that sunscreen, being an umbrella, however you want to think about it. And there are just a lot of ways that trees interact, not necessarily in the way that humans want to think about it, but in their own ways. And they kind of keep each other healthy and happy. So,
one question I had, and if I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on the two different perspectives that were offered in the movie. One was the Canadian scientist, Suzanne Simard, I believe is her name, versus the German guy, Peter Wohlenben. And she would describe the same thing very scientifically, and then he would say, oh, the trees are cuddling their young, or something like that, which obviously it was almost like the same thing that they were talking about. But I was I love the difference in language and how it was described, and where he took on more of the human characteristics, kind of applied those, and she, would then they'd cut to her talking, explaining it in a scientific way. And I don't know, I found that kind of fascinating. I don't know how you all felt about that, if you thought that one was more compelling than the other, or I don't know. I thought that was part of the entertainment of the movie for me. So, but you had talked about insects, and actually I skipped over a question from Denise Pettengill about the status of ash trees and the emerald ash borer that's been going on. What do you know about that? And I mean, do the trees, obviously their defense against that has not been effective, but
Yeah.
what's going on with that situation?
Well, I guess the short answer is that we're seeing a pretty significant decline in the ash population, citywide, countywide. I guess at this point, the thing that I would state to folks is, if you have an ash tree in your yard and you really like it and you really want to keep it, treatment is a really good option, and you should probably contact your local arborist to to come out and do an assessment for you. And there's been a few folks that have asked me if their trees are worth saving, and I'm more than happy usually to go out and take a look at folks' trees if you have questions. Okay. So certainly reach out if you care to.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there are some areas of the city that we're seeing a pretty significant decline in, although citywide it's pretty obvious. And I would guess that folks know by now, but the city does have kind of an EAB strategy. And so in 2015, we went through and did an inventory and took a look at all of our ash, and said, hey, which of these are in good enough condition that they're worth saving, what's worth treating, and what's in valuable enough areas that we should really take care of them. And so they'd set out their criteria for what they were going to treat and what they weren't. And so we treat about I imagine it's going to be about 600 trees over the past 2 years. Which, I mean, we have, I think the number's around like 4,500 ash trees on the right of way.
Okay.
So, but we also at the same time we're doing ash removals as well. So we're trying to work through, and right now we're kind of just trying to work triage. We're trying to do the worst of the trees and get to the ones that are next to be worst as fast as we can. But it's a really daunting task, and doing that while at the same time still trying to maintain all of the other trees and do all of our normal things. It just is a difficult thing to balance, but we're working on it. So
we have 2 in our yard and we've been treating them, so we're keeping our fingers crossed.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, so far so good.
Yeah, it's there are some that are for what they are. Some are really beautiful trees. Some serve a really good purpose. Like I looked at one for a guy the other day that we looked at it mid-morning, and I could see that it was shading his second story deck. And I could see his patio set there, and I was sitting there thinking, I bet you sit there every morning, and drink coffee in the shade of this tree. And if it's not there, your coffee drinking is going to be way less enjoyable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Angie is commented that she has The Hidden Life of Trees on Hold at the Library, which is actually written by Peter Wohlleben, who was in the movie The German Scientist.
Mhm.
And Margie, didn't you say you read that?
I read it a couple of years ago and just fell in love with the idea, particularly because I'm in an area where there are so many trees. And then I read the overstory, and then I read The Nature of Oaks, which is by another naturalist. So quite a few books on trees. I'm just fascinated by the whole concept of the hidden life of trees. And as I mentioned in my comments, he has a really good book out for kids now.
Oh,
Really?
yeah, the Overstory was great. That was my book club's #1 pick, I think, for 2018. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning, it's fiction, but it's all about these concepts of the interconnectivity of trees. So
I really loved it.
yeah, it's an awesome book, really fantastic. And Connie's comment is, we love the Arboretum, but after watching the movie about how trees like to be in a community, I'm worried that the design of the Arboretum is not as tree friendly as it could be. Do you have any thoughts on the Arboretum?
Yeah, so, I guess we kind of need to consider, the age of the Arboretum, where it is now. And also, I guess, kind of trying to think how to word this. I mean, when you think about the space and what it is, and what they're trying to do, everything we do, we're kind of trying to do the best that we can with what we have. And so I think once those trees reach more maturity, it'll end up being a really cool space. Right now it kind of seems, I mean, I don't know whether disconnected would be the thing, but it's a lot of younger trees that are, kind of plotted out in, and otherwise in a park around a pond. There are some, really interesting specimens and stuff. And I kind of hope to maybe get more involved with where things are planted and how things are planted and what's planted out there in the future. But right now I kind of have enough things on my plate.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah.
and it started, I mean, the environment there's kind of prairie-like. It's not like there's a lot of mother trees around. There's some, but they're kind of across the street.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, I live not too far from there, and we planted every tree in our yard except for 2. And it is, when you're in the middle of a field, it's a little harder. But yeah, no, I think I agree with you. I think eventually it'll be a really lovely space. It's just going to take some time.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'm curious to hear from the rest of you, kind of what do you think of the movie? I mean, was this something you'd recommend to a friend? What were some of the fun facts that you learned from it? Anyone want to?
I liked what you mentioned about the juxtaposition of their viewpoint, the scientific versus the friendly, sort of down to earth, I guess. I don't know how else to explain it. Because I like the science part, but I really liked Wollenben's book as well. So it was kind of nice to see them together. And actually to have them both actually in the movie was really fun for me.
Yeah, I agree. I thought that part of it was really neat to kind of get the 2 perspectives. And I also was just kind of, there's so many interesting things, like not the mushrooms, I guess the fungi, the fungus, the mushrooms are the fruit. I learned that, and just how that acts as the intermediary. And Levi, you had talked about how you've really gotten into fungi and mushrooms and things like that lately. Can you share with us some of what you've learned on that? I think there's a really good documentary out about that right now.
There is.
Yeah. And so I had a friend in Springfield who actually ran a food truck, and he grew almost all of the stuff that he cooked. And so he got into growing mushrooms because he really liked to use mushrooms in his food, and he grew shiitakes and oyster mushrooms and wine caps, and I thought it was super cool. So I got into growing shiitakes, and I like went way over the top. My first go around, I inoculated 60 logs,
Wow.
which fortunately not all of them ended up producing, because I would have had mushrooms coming out of my ears. But it's always been something that I've found really interesting, and I'm really into foraging and eating wild plants and that kind of stuff. But lately I've been just reading a lot and listening to a lot of audiobooks and stuff about mycology, and it's all just, it's pretty incredible. From a tree science standpoint, the whole forageable thing is usually a bad thing, because most of the organisms that fruit out of trees are generally killing them. And so that the arborist side of me usually cringes a little bit whenever I find some nice oyster mushrooms fruiting out of an elm tree or something. But then the forager side of me is really excited. So it's a weird conflict.
Yeah. No, it's I thought that was a pretty interesting kind of, I don't know, that the fungus as an intermediary was pretty fascinating. Margie says the Fantastic Fungi is the name of the really cool documentary.
Yeah.
Looks like Shelley really liked the movie. She gave it 12 stars, which is more than our normal 5. And both Maggie and Dave will recommend it to a friend. So Charlie is asking, are we planting many new trees in the city and county?
Well, I can't, I guess, speak to the county. As the city, we're doing our best. So I think this year we're going to end up planting around, I don't know, 400 or so trees. So part of that's through the city's master street tree plan. So anytime that a property is replatted or new property is platted, or there's going to be new construction, those properties come with trees. So it's part of the permit that goes into all of that. Usually it's 2 trees per property, but it's supposed to be 1 for every 40 feet of street frontage. But then we also we plant trees in house. So the horticulture department and my crew kind of split that obligation, just because none of us really fully have the time to do all of it. But we'll end up planting, I think, around 200 or so trees in house, maybe 250-ish. So our plan is to get 75 in the ground this fall. So
Wow.
um
So, I mean, one thing that the movie really talked about was when you replant to, not just replant single species, to, at least do more than one. And Jack and Maureen are asking, with all the forest fires now, are we single species replanting or not? Do you know what the process or the logistics are for those sorts of areas?
Yeah, so we've tried to keep with so there's a standard that basically is that you shouldn't plant more than 5% of any given species, more than 10% of any given genus, and 20% of any given family. So like I could plant 5% of our, well, the idea is, total urban forest, I guess. we don't want more than, 5% pin oaks, and we don't want more than 10% oaks in general, or we don't want more than 20% Fagaceae family, which is the family that oaks are in. Which I guess is kind of easier to do because really oaks are the only thing in that family that do super well, other than there is one really cool beech tree in North Lawrence that I found the other day that is also in that family. But then, you think about like maples, everybody wants that tree that has really good fall color. And so a lot of maples get planted. And I would guess that probably 30% of our urban forest is maple right now, which is concerning to me, obviously, because we just don't want that many. So we're looking at trying to find other options for trees that have really good fall color, that are outside of that. So one tree that we're planting more of is black gum, which it hasn't been a super common tree in the past, although it's getting more popularity. But they have just some really cool fall color, nice bold red that folks really go for. So
are there trees that are better companions than others? I mean, or just do a better job of, spreading out the nutrients or sharing things than other species or other types of trees?
Trying to think, I guess. So, more of what we look at, as opposed, I guess, not necessarily nutrient availability and that kind of stuff, just because, truthfully, we just kind of assume that our urban forest is actually kind of nutrient poor. Is probably the easiest way to describe that. But a lot of what we look at is water availability. So, if we know we have a low-lying area that gets a lot of moisture, then we're planting those more bottomland trees that do really well in those areas. I guess that's in the case of something where we know there's excess, right? So if we know that it's a really wet spot, it's low, it's wet all the time, then we're planting something like a sycamore or a bald cypress, that's really going to thrive in that environment. That's actually kind of to some extent probably actually going to mitigate some of that moisture if it's a problem. But then, where we know we have adequate moisture, then we're trying to plant those things that are a little more sensitive to that. So like some of our maples, or, black gum is one that really kind of wants a wetter condition. But then there's, trees that just kind of are those standby that we are just gonna deal with whatever junk we put them in.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, we do have just really heavy clay soils that are really dry. And so, in that case, we're usually throwing like an elm or something like that in there that just doesn't seem to care.
That sort of relates to Shelley's question, which is how important is it to plant native trees, or because of climate change, should at least some of the trees we plant be non-native?
Yeah, so both of those are really, I guess, really important things to think about whenever we're planning this. So we do plant a lot of natives. We plant bur oaks and chinkapin oaks. We're working on getting more hickories planted, which is a tree that I love and does really well. Sorry, my cat's cuddling my phone right now. But yeah, there is something to be said for the fact that, our environment is changing, and for what it's worth, our urban soils and our urban environment isn't necessarily the same as our urban or our native forests. So, and even with that, there's a lot of variation. You can look at some areas that are, I guess, what we would consider to be newer forests that are going to be more things like redbuds and elms, kind of the things we would consider to be softer trees. Whereas if you look at our older growth forests, you're going to find more of the oaks and hickories. And all of that comes from the fact that sorry, don't mind this guy. This is my very large cat here. But all of that comes from the fact that trees in the forest rely really heavily on nutrient cycling. And without getting too scientific, they rely on fungus and soil microbes to be very healthy, to provide them with the nutrition that they need. And those things rely really heavily on varying length carbon chains, right? So they need not just leaf material, but they need woody material, and they need large woody material and small woody material, and they need all of these different things, the fungus and the soil microbes and all these things, to promote a really, really healthy soil that then can support those what we would consider to be climax community species. So in Kansas, I would say, probably the quintessential climax community is bur oaks, and in this part, bur oaks, chinkapin, and hickories. And so there's a lot that goes into all of that. And in the end, we're not going to find that soil health in an urban soil. So we really kind of have to look at what does well in those soils and what does well with changing environment and that kind of stuff. So
Yeah. So Denise is asking, who approves trees in the site plans? Like trees that are inappropriate for that particular site can get approved and then later end up getting badly pruned because that tree should have never been approved for the site. Like trees obstructing sight lines, badly pruned trees due to overhead wires, etc. So what are the logistics? Like who decides what kind of trees go into the site plans?
So that's kind of there's usually several hands involved in all of that. So part of that is planning and development and code enforcement, and part of that is the horticulture and forestry manager, which is my boss. So in the past that was Crystal Miles, and now that's a guy named Tyler Fike. And we do our best to try to avoid those issues, and anymore we're trying to be more mindful of what we call the site triangle. So whenever you're coming up on intersections, it's in our city tree code that there's not supposed to be, if there's a tree within the site triangle, which is 50 feet in either direction from the intersection. So if you think about it, 50 feet and 50 feet, and then the line that connects those two, right? That's our site triangle, and that's what we need visibility for cars coming up on that intersection. So any vegetation growing there either has to be raised to at least 8 feet or under 36 inches. And that hasn't always been something that we've thought about a lot. It's something we're trying to change. And sometimes, homeowners just go about planting things, wherever they think that they belong, and we have to deal with things.
That's the Morgan way.
So, yeah. And there's always, there's utility conflicts. And sometimes whenever you're looking at a plat, you're looking at a site plan and you say, well, we need this many trees and these would do well in this neighborhood. Or sometimes HOAs have planting plans that, the sites have to be planted with things from that planting plan. And so we're just trying to make the things fit for what the HOA has determined.
Right.
And so, I mean, for what it's worth, there are a lot of moving pieces, and everybody that looks at those plans is looking at it through a different scope. And we're all just trying to do the best we can. And that isn't, that isn't me trying to make an excuse, because sometimes things get planted that, I go look at and say, boy, that was the dumbest thing somebody could have put there.
Yeah.
One,
Margie has a question saying that beech bark disease is starting to decimate trees in Michigan. Have you seen any evidence of that in Lawrence?
Well, I haven't. And a big part of that is that we don't have native beeches in our area, and it's not actually an easy tree to grow here. So like I think I'd mentioned earlier, there are a handful of what we call tricolor beech, which is a form of European beech that is an ornamental. They have kind of a cool variegated mottled leaf that some folks have, but there is one, I believe it's an American beech on Locust Street in North Lawrence, and it's the only mature full-size beech that I know of in the city of Lawrence. It's the only one that I've seen. So unless there's one poked in a backyard somewhere that I've yet to see, it's just really not a common thing for folks to grow. So,
yeah. So Grandpa and Grandma Mimi asks, where are the good local sources, I presume, for trees? Like, what would you recommend in terms of good places that are good local tree suppliers?
I guess, it all kind of depends on what you're looking for. I mean, if you really want unique things or you want native things, and I don't have a whole lot of experience, wandering our local nurseries and stuff, but I know like Vinland Valley Nursery here north of Baldwin has some really good stuff, and they have a lot of natives. I'm trying to think here. One really cool way to get trees that should do well is actually through the Forest Service. So they do have conservation plantings that you can buy. They're usually, so they're saplings, they're smaller trees, which a lot of folks don't like, but they do really well. And they have it broke down by zone, so you can figure out, according to where you live, what they recommend. But I was just looking at some stuff from them to poke in my own yard, just because I have some.
No.
I live in a 120-year-old house, and I have some very old pin oaks in the front yard that aren't in great shape, and so I know I have to replace them somewhere down the line. So.
Well, now's the time to start. Take a while.
Yeah.
Angie is asking, does the Forest Service and lumber companies buy into the science that was presented in the movie and the book? So the idea that, things are interconnected, you need to not just do single source planning, that sort of thing. I mean,
well, yes. So I will say, I would say the Forest Service definitely does, at least to the extent of, I would talk about the Kansas Forest Service. And, that entity in and of itself faces its own challenges, because a large part of what they're looking at is, what homeowners or property owners have and their goal for how they want to maintain a property. So they write, a forest health plan for those homeowners based off of what their goal is for their property. So if they want to do timber production, which some people do, they want to raise oaks or walnuts or whatever on their property for the sake of selling them. And so then they're writing those plans based off of, well, this is the trees you should get rid of if you want to promote the health of these other trees that you intend to sell. Mm-hmm. But then they also do really cool things like, forest health programs and working on repairing areas. And so it's a very unique beast, and there's a lot of perception about, I think, what folks think that the Forest Service means and what it should be. If any of you have ever read Bill Bryson's book, A Walk in the Woods, which is a really good book, but I think there's about a chapter of him basically just berating the U.S. Forest Service because he just doesn't think that they do a good job. And I think that what folks assume is their job is maybe a bit of a misnomer from what they get labeled. So
Yeah.
anyway.
Well, Shelley points out that Wollenben, the German scientist, comments that speed is the enemy of forests, and the lumber industry at the same time is concentrated on growing trees quickly. So there's a real disconnect between the priorities there. And
and I mean, I have no problem venturing the assessment that I don't think the forest or the logging companies really care at all about the health of the forest, aside from where it stands in the way of their bottom line. You know, they want those trees to be planted in a perfectly straight row and grow perfectly straight, and lots of them that in 20 years they can come through and just clear cut again and have nice straight wood for building houses. So their objective is not by any means forest health. So,
right.
Yeah.
No, different priorities. It's kind of what you're talking about, of that tension of, you know, trying to find the balance between producing the products that people need, but also being environmentally responsible as well. So it's tough.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting close to 8. And so I'm going to share with you a little gift from Kathy Hamilton that she sent this way. And hopefully I will share my screen appropriately. Hang on just a sec. Whoops, hang on. I need to make sure that I click the right button. Otherwise you won't be able to hear it. So those of you who are Ted Lasso fans, I'm going to play, this is just a 41-second clip, and you will feel very hip to the groove after you watch this.
Hey, let's go ahead and try out your fake 9.
False 9.
Hey, this looks very nice.
Thank you. Here we go again. Give Ted yet another idea he'll take all the credit for.
That's the job, Sam.
Do you guys ever want to be in charge? Be the boss? Get all the credit? You know, we used to believe that trees competed with each other for light. Suzanne Simard's fieldwork challenged that perception, and we now realize that the forest is a socialist community. Trees work in harmony to share the sunlight. Can't you just give me a straight answer for once?
I think you just did.
There you go. Those of you who are Ted Lasso fans should appreciate that. So why don't you unmute and we will give Levi a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Well,
so we really
thank you all for attending.
Yeah, what a great crowd.
Can I interject an idea for Levi?
Sure.
I don't know how many of you saw CBS Sunday Morning, but they had a little snip on aspen, and they parasailed over the aspen in Aspen, Colorado. So if you get tired of climbing trees, you could always parasail over trees.
I bet that was absolutely fantastic at this time of
I
year.
think so. It was really yellow.
Like sailing over a sea of gold. So.
Sounds like a Parks and Rec fundraiser to me. I think that sounds perfect.
I'll see if I can get that travel request approved.
That's right. I love it. We sell tickets. All right. Well, thank you again for coming. We really appreciate it. And we will keep you posted on the next dinner and a movie, I guess dessert and a movie program next month will come up. If anybody has any suggestions, please send them to Kathy or me. This was actually the Altman's choice this time. So thank you very much, Jack and Maureen. And next week, I believe a week from tomorrow, Thursday, is wine night. City Wine Market is back in action. So if you are interested in that, please sign up on the library website. We'd love to have you. So have a wonderful evening and thank you so much for joining us. Take care.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.